There is something happening inside your mind right now that you did not choose, did not ask for, and are almost certainly unaware of. It has been happening since before you could speak, before you could form your first memory, before you had any concept of who you were or what the world was. It is the reason you feel comfortable in certain rooms and uneasy in others. It is the reason some people remind you of someone you once knew, even when they share no obvious resemblance. It is the reason you sometimes know what a person is about to say before they finish saying it. Your brain is not waiting to receive reality. It is building it moment by moment out of everything it has ever learned to expect. This is not a metaphor. It is not a philosophical abstraction. It is one of the most significant discoveries in modern neuroscience, and yet most people move through their entire lives completely unaware that it is happening to them. They believe they are seeing the world as it is. They believe their feelings arise from what is real. They believe their choices are responses to circumstances. But the science tells a different story, and it is one that is far stranger, far more intimate, and far more consequential than most people are prepared to consider. To understand it, you have to start somewhere most people never think to look. Uh, you have to start with the fundamental problem that your brain was built to solve. The skull is dark, completely and permanently dark. No light enters it, no sound, no texture, no temperature. Everything you have ever experienced, every face, every landscape, every sensation of warmth or cold or pain or pleasure has reached your brain not as direct experience, but as electrical signals traveling along neural pathways. The brain never touches the world. It sits sealed inside its bone casing, receiving only encoded information, second-hand data, the faintest echoes of whatever is actually happening outside it. And yet somehow, out of this darkness, it must construct an entire reality, one that is coherent enough to navigate, detailed enough to act within, and fast enough to keep you alive. The solution the brain evolved to this problem is elegant in a way that feels almost uncomfortable once you understand it. Rather than waiting to receive information and then interpreting it, which would be far too slow, far too metabolically expensive, the brain does something far more efficient. It makes predictions first. It generates its best guess about what the world currently contains, based on everything it has encountered before, and then it checks incoming sensory data against that prediction. If the data matches, it barely registers consciously. If it doesn't match, the brain updates. Neuroscientists call this predictive processing, and while the term is clinical, the reality it describes is almost poetic. You are not a passive receiver of experience. You are, in the most literal sense, a prediction machine, and what you call reality is largely the output of that machine. The philosopher Andy Clark, who has spent much of his career examining this framework, described the brain as something like a controlled hallucination. Not in the derogatory sense of the word, not a delusion or a disconnection from reality, but in the technical sense that what you perceive is a model generated internally and then tested against the world, rather than a direct feed from it. Your visual cortex, for instance, receives far more input from other parts of the brain than it does from your eyes. The eyes send raw data upward. The brain sends predictions downward. What you see is, in large part, what your brain expected to see. This might sound abstract. Let me make it concrete. Think about the last time you drove somewhere familiar, somewhere you have driven hundreds of times and arrived with almost no memory of the journey. You stopped at red lights, you navigated intersections, you adjusted your speed in traffic, but you were not really conscious of doing any of it. Another part of your mind had taken over, one running on deeply grooved predictions. It already knew this road. It already knew what to expect at every turn. And because there were no significant prediction errors, no unexpected obstacles, no sudden detours, almost nothing rose to the surface of conscious awareness. Your brain had predicted the entire drive and was simply confirming it in real time. Now think about the first time you ever drove that same road. Every intersection felt significant. Every traffic pattern required attention. Your hands probably gripped the wheel more tightly than they needed to. That is what it feels like when the brain has not yet built a reliable prediction model. It must work harder, allocate more conscious resources, stay more alert to error. Experience over time converts that effortful attention into automated prediction. And once something is predicted well enough, it largely disappears from conscious awareness. This is one of the brain's great efficiencies, but it is also, in ways that take time to fully appreciate, one of its most significant limitations, because here is what follows from all of this. If the brain's primary task is prediction, if perception itself is shaped by what the brain already expects, then what you notice, what you feel, and what you believe is possible are all, to a substantial degree, determined by the predictions your brain has already formed. The world you inhabit is not neutral. It is pre-filtered. You are at every moment seeing a version of reality that has already been shaped by everything you have come to expect from it. And here is the question that should sit with you for a moment before we go further. When were those predictions formed? And did you choose them? The honest answer for most people is that the most foundational predictions, the ones that run deepest, the ones that shape the largest structures of a life, were formed long before there was any capacity for conscious choice. They were formed in childhood, when the brain was at its most plastic, when it was absorbing patterns of experience with extraordinary speed and encoding them as the baseline model for how reality works. A child raised in an environment of scarcity does not just learn that food or money is sometimes limited. The brain encodes that scarcity as a prediction. It begins to expect limitation as the default state of the world. A child who grows up around conflict learns not just that conflict sometimes happens, but begins to scan environments for its earliest signals. The amygdala becomes calibrated for threat. The nervous system learns to anticipate danger and begins to find it even where it is faint, even where others might not notice it at all. These are not moral failures. They are not weaknesses of character. They are the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, learning from experience, to building prediction models, preparing the organism for the world it expects to encounter. The problem arises not from the mechanism itself, but from a particular feature of the mechanism that almost no one is taught to think about. Prediction models, once formed, do not automatically update when circumstances change. They persist, they run. They filter incoming information through the lens of what was already expected. And because perception itself is shaped by prediction, a person carrying old prediction models often does not notice the evidence that would update them. Their brain, in the most literal neurological sense, filters that evidence out before it reaches conscious awareness. This is what attentional bias means at its deepest level. It is not simply that people pay more attention to things that confirm what they already believe, though that is certainly part of it. It is that the brain's perceptual machinery is organized around its predictions. What is expected is processed more easily, more fluently, with less metabolic effort. What is unexpected requires more processing, more energy, more conscious attention. And in an organism designed for efficiency, the unexpected often loses. A person who has come to expect rejection will notice the slight hesitation in another's voice before they notice the warmth in their expression, not because they are irrational, not because they are difficult, but because their brain's prediction model has been tuned through repeated experience to detect the earliest possible signal of the pattern it already knows. It is trying to help, it is trying to prepare. It learned at some point that preparation was necessary, and it is still learning that. The cruel irony of this is that it can become self-reinforcing in ways that are genuinely difficult to see from the inside. The person expecting rejection may contract slightly, may become a little more guarded, may subtly signal their own uncertainty, and that contraction may in turn produce the very response they feared, which the brain then uses to update and confirm its existing prediction. Not because the world is cruel and not because the person is helpless, but because the feedback loop between prediction and perception can, under certain conditions, become a closed circuit. Neuroscientists sometimes talk about this in terms of priors, a term borrowed from Bayesian probability. A prior is simply the brain's existing estimate of how likely something is before it receives any new evidence. The brain weighs new evidence against its priors, and the stronger the prior, the more evidence it takes to move it. A prior formed in childhood, reinforced through years of consistent experience, can be so robust that it takes extraordinary evidence to shift it, and the brain, helpfully, may not even allow that extraordinary evidence to reach the level of conscious evaluation in the first place. This is not fatalism. It is not a story about being permanently imprisoned by your past, but it is something more subtle and more challenging than simple optimism would suggest. It is a story about the architecture of experience itself, about the way the structure of the mind shapes the structure of a life. Consider for a moment what this means for identity. Most people, when they think about who they are, think about their personality, their values, their preferences, their history. But underneath all of those layers, there is something more foundational, a set of predictions about the world and about the self that function almost like a gravitational field. They pull behavior toward certain patterns, certain relationships, certain outcomes, not through force, but through the quiet, continuous influence of expectation on perception, on interpretation, on the decisions that feel natural versus the ones that feel dangerous or strange or simply not like something you would do. Identity-based behavior, in the framework of modern behavioral science, is not primarily about conscious decision-making. It is about the predictions that feel so fundamental to who a person is that acting against them requires a kind of energy that is simply not available in ordinary moments. The person who says they are not the kind of person who speaks up in meetings is not simply making a statement about their behavior. They are describing a deeply encoded prediction that speaking up leads to consequences that are worse than silence. That prediction may have been formed in a classroom at age 9. It may have been reinforced in a family where a particular kind of visibility was unsafe. But it now runs as a feature of identity, and it shapes behavior with the quiet authority of something simply known. The neuroscientist Anil Seth has written that our experience of being a self, the felt sense of being a continuous, persistent person moving through time, is itself a kind of prediction. The brain generates a model not just of the external world, but of the entity navigating it. Your sense of who you are, moment to moment, is in significant part the brain's best current guess about the nature of the organism doing the perceiving. And like all predictions, it is built from history, filtered through expectation, and updated only when evidence becomes strong enough to break through. This is a strange thing to sit with. The self that feels most immediate and most certain, the one reading or listening right now, is, at some level, a model, a constructed thing. Extraordinarily sophisticated, extraordinarily useful, but a model nonetheless, built from patterns, running on predictions, carrying the accumulated weight of every experience that shaped it, and carrying, too, the accumulated weight of experiences that happened to people who came before. There is a field of research, still relatively young but increasingly robust, that examines how certain patterns of response to threat and stress can be transmitted across generations, not through culture or explicit teaching alone, but through epigenetic mechanisms, modifications to gene expression that can be influenced by experience and passed to offspring. The research on this is nuanced and contested, and it would be irresponsible to overstate its conclusions. But the broader point, supported by substantial evidence, is that the prediction models a person carries are not formed solely in their own lifetime. They are shaped by the adaptive responses of lineages that survived because they were appropriately calibrated for the threats their world contained. The nervous system that is easily startled, that remains vigilant, that expects less than it hopes for, that nervous system may have been an extraordinary advantage 3 generations ago. It may have kept someone alive through conditions that rewarded exactly that kind of calibration. And now it runs in a body sitting in safety, still scanning for dangers that no longer exist, still filtering the world through the lens of an ancestral prediction that was never consciously chosen and has never been formally revised. This is one of the quieter forms of inheritance, and it operates almost entirely below the level of awareness. But perhaps the most profound implication of the predictive processing framework is not what it tells us about where our predictions come from. It is what it tells us about what we are capable of perceiving at all. Experiments in psychology and cognitive science have repeatedly demonstrated that people are dramatically better at detecting information that fits their existing models of the world than information that contradicts it. This is not a subtle effect. It is not a minor statistical tendency. In some conditions, people looking directly at something unexpected will fail to register it entirely, what researchers call inattentional blindness, not because of any fault in their vision, but because the brain had not predicted that object and therefore did not allocate attentional resources to processing it. The famous experiment where participants counting basketball passes failed to notice a person in a gorilla costume walking through the scene is often cited as a charming curiosity. But its implications run much deeper than that. It suggests that attention itself, the thing we tend to think of as our most basic tool for understanding the world, is not neutral. It is allocated according to prediction. The brain decides, below conscious awareness, what is worth noticing and what can be safely ignored. And it makes that decision based on what it already expects. Now extend that insight from a laboratory experiment to a life. A person who has come to expect that opportunities are rare or that good things tend not to last will navigate their world with attentional resources already organized around that prediction. They will notice evidence of scarcity and impermanence more readily, more fluently, with greater emotional resonance. They will process evidence of abundance and stability with more friction, more skepticism, more of the metabolic effort associated with unexpected information. And here is the remarkable part: none of this requires any intention. It happens in the automatic operations of a brain that is simply doing its job, running its models, allocating its resources according to the best predictions it has. This is why two people can walk through the same environment and come away with genuinely different accounts of it, not because one of them is lying or deceived, but because their brains ran different prediction models and therefore genuinely perceived different things. They were not seeing the same world and interpreting it differently. They were, in a meaningful sense, seeing different worlds. And this is the point at which something that has long existed at the margins of psychology and popular culture begins to look less like mysticism and more like mechanism. There is a concept that has circulated widely in personal development culture for decades, often described in terms of manifestation or the law of attraction, usually in ways that range from loosely metaphorical to frankly supernatural. Most serious scientists have dismissed it, and with good reason. Many of its popular formulations make claims that are not supported by evidence and that can cause genuine harm by implying that suffering is simply a failure of positive thinking. But underneath the overstatements, underneath the magical thinking, there is a kernel of something that the neuroscience of prediction actually illuminates in a rather sober and specific way. When a person genuinely believes, not as an affirmation, not as a wishful thought, but at the level of a deep prediction, a prior so well established it feels like fact that something is possible for them. That belief does not sit passively in the mind. It organizes perception, it allocates attention, it shapes what the brain notices, what it pursues, what it recognizes as an opportunity versus what it dismisses or fails to register at all. A person who expects to find connection will walk into a room with a nervous system slightly more open, slightly more attuned to the earliest signals of warmth in others. They will notice a smile that a more guarded person might interpret as polite blankness. They will linger in a conversation a moment longer, take a risk a little more easily, and through those small behavioral differences, each one almost too small to be called a choice, they will have a measurably different social experience, not because the universe rearranged itself around their belief, but because their prediction model organized their behavior and perception in ways that made a certain kind of outcome more likely. This is not magic, but it is not nothing. It is the brain's predictive architecture working exactly as designed, shaping reality not through intention alone, but through the continuous, automatic influence of expectation on every layer of experience. The problem, of course, is that this mechanism is morally indifferent. It works with equal efficiency whether the predictions it runs are expansive or constricting, whether they were chosen wisely or inherited accidentally, whether they serve the person carrying them or quietly diminish them. The brain does not evaluate its prediction models for their usefulness to the life being lived. It simply runs them with the same diligence it has always brought to its primary task of keeping the organism alive and coherent. And this is where neuroplasticity becomes relevant, not as a motivational concept, not as the comforting idea that people can change if they just try hard enough, but as a literal description of the brain's structural relationship with experience. The brain is not fixed. Every piece of evidence points toward a nervous system that remains throughout life capable of revising its models in response to experience. The mechanisms are different in adulthood than in the hyperplastic early years of childhood. Change is slower, requires more repetition, demands more sustained engagement with experiences that contradict the existing predictions. But the capacity is present. The architecture allows for it. Neuroplasticity in the predictive processing framework is essentially the brain's ability to update its priors, to receive sufficiently strong prediction errors, experiences that deviate enough from expectation, and to revise the internal model rather than simply explaining the deviation away. The brain, by default, prefers to explain new information in terms of existing models. It takes something significant, something that cannot easily be assimilated, to trigger genuine structural revision. This is why change that happens at the level of conscious intention alone tends to be unstable. A person can decide, with full sincerity and genuine commitment, to believe something different about themselves or the world. But if the deep prediction model, the prior encoded in years of experience and operating below conscious access, has not been updated, the conscious intention is working against the grain of the brain's most fundamental operations. The new thought is upstream of its own neurobiology. This is not to say that conscious intention is meaningless. It is not, but its power seems to lie less in the direct force of will and more in its ability to organize behavior in ways that generate the experiences needed to update the prediction model from the inside. The person who decides to act as if they are capable of something even before they feel capable is not simply faking it. They are creating the conditions for prediction error for experiences that the existing model cannot assimilate without revision. And over time, with sufficient repetition and sufficient engagement, those experiences begin to change the prior itself. This is slow. It is nonlinear. It does not feel like the dramatic transformations that stories tend to celebrate. It feels, from the inside, more like a gradual loosening, a slight increase in what feels natural, a slight decrease in the internal friction associated with certain choices. It is the brain revising its predictions, which feels subjectively almost like nothing, until one day you notice that something which once seemed impossible has quietly become ordinary. There is another dimension to all of this that is worth dwelling on because it sits at the intersection of the personal and the profoundly social. The prediction models that individuals carry are not formed in isolation. They are formed in the context of families, communities, cultures, and they are shaped in ways that are often invisible precisely because they are so pervasive by the collective predictions of the world a person inhabits. Every culture encodes predictions, predictions about who can do what, about what belongs to whom, about which futures are realistic and which are fantasies, about who is the kind of person whose aspirations deserve serious consideration and who is not. These cultural predictions are not primarily transmitted through explicit statements. They are transmitted through the texture of ordinary experience, through who is represented where, through what gets celebrated and what gets ignored, through the subtle but relentless patterning of who succeeds and what they look like when they do. A person absorbs these cultural predictions through the same mechanisms they absorb any other prediction. They are processed, encoded, and integrated into the brain's model of what is possible, not as beliefs consciously held, but as priors deeply felt. And they shape perception and behavior with the same quiet authority as any other deeply held expectation. This is part of why social change is so slow and so genuinely difficult, and so resistant to purely rational arguments. You are not arguing with conscious beliefs. You are arguing with prediction models formed through years of lived experience, models that feel, from the inside, less like opinions and more like facts about the world. The evidence that contradicts them requires extraordinary weight to be processed as evidence rather than as anomaly or exception. And yet it does happen. It happens because the brain, even with its deep preference for confirmation, cannot entirely filter out sufficiently strong prediction errors. When enough counter-evidence accumulates, when enough people whose predictions were constricted by cultural expectation encounter experiences that those predictions cannot account for, the priors begin to shift slowly, generation by generation. but they shift. The individual scale and the cultural scale are not separate processes. They are the same process operating at different levels of aggregation. The person who revises their own predictions about what is possible for them is, in some small but real way, contributing to the cultural prediction field that shapes what seems possible for others. This is perhaps the most quietly radical implication of everything we have been exploring. The interior work of examining and updating prediction models is not merely personal. It is, in its own subtle way, a form of participation in something larger, but we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of this becomes meaningful at the scale of action, it has to become visible at the scale of awareness. And that is perhaps the rarest and most difficult step. Most people never pause to notice the predictions their brain is running, not because they are incurious or unaware, but because the predictions that matter most are not the ones that feel like guesses. They are the ones that feel like facts. They are the ones so deeply encoded, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of experience that they have long since ceased to feel like anything at all. They have simply become the texture of the world. The prediction that says, I am the kind of person who does not announce itself as a prediction. It announces itself as knowledge. The prediction that says things like that do not work out for people like me does not feel like an expectation. It feels like evidence. The prediction that says this is just how people are, this is just how the world works, that one barely registers as a thought at all. It is simply the water the mind swims in, invisible by virtue of its completeness. And this is why the insight at the heart of predictive processing is more than a scientific fact. It is an invitation, not to a program or a technique or a set of practices, but to a different kind of relationship with the experience of one's own mind. A relationship that begins with a question simple enough to state and difficult enough to actually sit with. How much of what I take to be real is actually what I have come to expect, not as a rhetorical question, not as a thought experiment, but as a genuine, sustained, somewhat uncomfortable inquiry into the gap between what is and what the brain has learned to see. There is something unusual that happens when people begin to notice this, really notice it, not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived experience in the ordinary moments of a day. A conversation that was about to go a certain way and suddenly opens into something unexpected. A person who was being read through the lens of a past person and who, when the lens is even slightly loosened, reveals themselves to be genuinely different, an opportunity that was almost dismissed as unrealistic, and that, when held a moment longer before the prediction of impossibility fires, turns out to have been entirely real. These are small things, and they happen in the negative space of the predictions, in the tiny gap that opens when, for whatever reason, the brain's automatic model pauses just long enough for something unscripted to enter. The neuroscientist Carl Friston, whose work on predictive processing is among the most rigorous and far-reaching in the field, has described the fundamental drive of the brain as a drive to minimize prediction error, to move through the world in a way that keeps experience as close as possible to expectation. This is, at the deepest level, what the brain is optimizing for. Not truth, not growth, not expanded experience confirmation, the reduction of surprise, the comfort of a world that continues to resemble what it was expected to be. And from the perspective of evolutionary survival, this makes perfect sense. Surprise, in the ancestral environment, was frequently dangerous. An organism that could reliably predict its world, that had accurate models of where food was, where predators lurked, which social relationships could be trusted, had a significant advantage over one that was perpetually surprised by its circumstances, but we do not live in that environment anymore. We live in a world of extraordinary complexity and genuine possibility, a world where the range of what is available to human experience vastly exceeds what any individual brain is likely to predict as accessible to it. We live in a world where the limitation, for many people, is not the world itself, but the model the brain built of it before the person was old enough to question it. And here is the quiet strangeness at the center of all of this. The brain's drive to minimize surprise means that it will, by default, organize life in ways that confirm its predictions. It will not do this out of malice or limitation. It will do it out of efficiency, out of the fundamental logic of a system designed to operate with as little prediction error as possible. The most elegant outcome, from the brain's perspective, is a life that is exactly as expected, which means the life that is possible, the one that exists in the space beyond current predictions, may require something that the brain, left entirely to its own devices, will never quite get around to looking for, not because it cannot be found, but because the brain never predicted it was there. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a version of something you have already decided, not consciously decided, not deliberately, but at the level of prediction, at the level of the prior so deeply encoded it feels like fact. There is something you already know will happen, something you already know is how you are, something you already know is not available to someone like you. And the question, the only question, really, that matters at the end of all of this, is not how to change it, not yet, not yet. The question is whether you can, even for a moment, notice it. Whether you can catch the prediction mid-flight, before it lands, before it becomes experience, before it becomes memory, before it becomes the new evidence that confirms the old expectation. Whether you can feel the difference between what is actually in front of you and what your brain has been quietly, diligently, invisibly preparing you to see. That moment, that small, strange, slightly vertiginous moment of noticing is not a solution. It is not an answer. It is something older and more interesting than either of those things. It is the beginning of the question that most people never think to ask. Not who am I, not what do I want, but what has my mind already decided, and when did I agree to that,